we knew the exact tone that we wanted it to be. And Carl Reiner said to me, he said, you can establish the tone of the movie in the first 2 minutes, and you can tell the audience what the rules are and how far you're willing to go. And that's why the opening scene of The Jerk is ridiculous.
Steve Martin has some major grievances, whether he is a comedy legend or not. Beneath the humor and charisma, Martin harbored intense resentment for some of his co-stars who made his time on set dreadful. He remained silent about the stress for years. However, the truth is now at last being revealed. Let's examine the 6 performers Steve Martin publicly acknowledged he detested most about his employment. Chevy Chase. In 1980 SIX's Three Amigos, spectators witnessed 3 comic icons, Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, and Martin Short, delivering hearty laughs in a farce with a Western influence. The chemistry seemed natural on television, a real-life confrontation involving 3 incompetent silent film performers. However, things weren't nearly as easy behind the cameras. The movie became more of a trial of patience for Steve Martin, particularly when it came to working with Chevy Chase, rather than a celebration of humorous camaraderie. Martin brought his usual professionalism to the project. He arrived ready to set. He had co-written with Randy Newman and Lorne Michaels, so he was prepared to follow the script and knew his lines. For Martin, it was all about structure. Comedy was more than just jokes. It was about timing, rhythm, and having faith in the meticulously written screenplay. But Chevy Chase followed a different set of rules. Chevy, who was already well known from Saturday Night Live and movies like Caddyshack and Fletch, was regarded as smart in Hollywood, but he frequently resented authority figures, detested being controlled, and had a talent for rewriting scenes on the spot. That reputation followed him on Three Amigos. In order to get laughs for himself, he frequently switched lines, added quips that weren't in the script, and even broke takes to make gags. This could have appeared to be improvisational flair to some. However, it was upsetting to Martin, who valued planning and equilibrium. He didn't lose his temper or go straight to Chevy. For that, Steve Martin was much too subdued. Instead, he used stinging sarcasm, the only way he knew how to express his emotions. Martin once said something that captured his frustrations exactly. Chevy could buy Wall Street if money were ego. Everyone who heard the joke realized there was truth to the joke, even if it was given with a smile. Martin saw Chevy's desire to control every scene as more about ego than teamwork, transforming what ought to have been an ensemble comedy into a never-ending competition for viewers' attention. There was no full-fledged animosity resulting from the strain. The mood was tense, but there were no spectacular walkouts or yelling bouts on set. The third amigo, Martin Short, frequently acted as a mediator, overcoming Chase's unpredictable nature and Martin's professionalism. Nevertheless, the harm was done. Steve Martin made the silent decision at the end of filming that he didn't want to go through it again. Martin and Chase could have easily been reunited in later films because Hollywood is usually keen to profit from good partnerships. Martin, however, refused. Even though he was friendly in public, he never looked to work with Chevy again. He felt that one movie had been sufficient. Looking back, Three Amigos is a fascinating study of conflicting personalities as well as a cult favorite. Chevy Chase's frantic, ego-driven improvisation clashed with Steve Martin's precise, well-crafted comedy. Additionally, the process left wounds even though spectators laughed at the finished product. The two men's methods couldn't have been more different from one another. Martin was a symbol of discipline, a man who valued every beat and regarded humor as an art form. Chase embodied instinct. He was a performer who would stop at nothing to get laughs, even if it meant treading on his fellow actors. The irony was scathing for a movie that was supposed to highlight camaraderie, because Martin and Chase weren't even close when the cameras stopped rolling. Stories of mismatched personalities abound throughout the history of comedy and Hollywood, including Bette Midler. However, one of the more surprising confrontations was between Bette Midler, the diva of camp, music, and unrepentant theatrics, and Steve Martin, the king of controlled absurdity. Both were renowned for enthralling audiences and were formidable performers in their own right. However, the evening devolved into a lesson in timing, ego, and drastically different notions of teamwork when the two got together for what ought to have been a night of cooperation and goodwill. The scene was a well-known charity gala, the sort of occasion meant to highlight philanthropy and celebrity power. In typical Martin flair, Steve Martin tackled the role with precision after agreeing to co-host with Bette Midler. He had planned a scathing, clever monologue, the kind of well-balanced humor that was both elegant and satirical. Viewers have become accustomed to expecting no less from him. His television appearances and stand-up career were based on that careful framework. For Martin, being rigid was not the point of following the script. It was about establishing rhythm and honoring the focus of the audience. But Bette Midler took a very different tack. She thrived on spontaneity, surprise, and taking center stage, and was known as the Divine Miss M. She believed that scripts had no place at a gala. It has to do with spectacle. Therefore, Bette suddenly took a different turn as Steve began his monologue, attempting to establish the humorous tone for the evening. She abruptly dropped the prepared script and began to sing, her theatrically strong voice filling the room, effectively taking over the stage and drowning out Martin's words. That was a startling moment. It was more than simply a disturbance for Steve Martin. It was the breakdown of the meticulous equilibrium he had labored to establish. It might have appeared to an audience that two performers were sharing the limelight. Martin, meanwhile, saw it as sabotage, as if his part had been diminished to that of a prop in someone else's performance. Midler's extravagant performance abruptly overshadowed his wit, timing, and very presence, elements that always commanded rapt attention. Martin, always the epitome of professionalism, remained courteous. He didn't argue or snap, may make an effort to take back the attention at that precise moment. Rather, he remained calm, grinned despite the commotion, and let Midler go on. But you could feel the tension. Martin was left out of the co-hosting arrangement, which had turned into a one-woman show. Martin had had enough by the middle of the event. He left early, quietly, without spectacle, escaping the chaos of Midler's spontaneous takeover. His departure was a message rather than a tantrum. It was not the place of a man who valued teamwork, professionalism, and preparation to stand in the wings of what should have been his own stage. Martin's most incisive reply, however, was written down rather than spoken at the time. Along with his donation to the charity, he left a humorous and poignant statement. It said, "Silence," and you could guarantee it was from her biggest admirer. Irony, disappointment, and just enough sting to make his point were all expressed in just one line. Martin saw the conflict as one of respect rather than insecurity or jealousy. He had expected teamwork and a healthy dose of his sophisticated humor going into the occasion, and the dramatic vigor of Midler. Instead, he received a warning that some entertainers take the limelight rather than share it. Martin was on the sidelines while Midler, in her usual flashy fashion, turned what ought to have been a dual performance into her own stage. The conflict's aftermath was instructive. Martin was never the kind to revel in tabloid fireworks, even though neither started a public dispute. In Hollywood circles, the anecdote was shared as an illustration of how even the most seasoned performers may clash. The story that everyone recalled was Martin's scathing remark, a clever way of expressing his annoyance encased in the type of dry humor that only he could provide. The event also brought to light the two stars' glaring differences. Steve Martin exemplified the craftsman aspect of humor with his attention to timing, balance, and structure. The wild energy of performance art was personified by Bette Midler, who was audacious, aggressive, and unpredictable. In their own right, both were exceptional, but when combined, they were irreconcilable. Robin Williams. Audiences anticipate flashes of genius when two comic geniuses occupy the same stage. And that's what occurs most of the time. However, peace isn't always ignited by those sparks. They demonstrate the true differences between two artists. Steve Martin and Robin Williams, two comedic greats who respected one another but whose styles could never completely mix, were an example of this. Structure, accuracy, and wit were the cornerstones of Steve Martin's career. His timing was so precise that nothing was left to chance, and his humor was both absurdist and disciplined. Each gesture, pause, and punchline was thoughtfully chosen. Watching Martin perform was like witnessing the work of a master craftsman who skillfully combined intelligence and grace with humor. Conversely, Robin Williams embodied chaos and speed in real life. His performances were filled with improvisation, impersonations, and quick-witted quips, and his mind worked at a pace that was too fast for most people to follow. He became a cyclone of humor rather than merely delivering it. The wild unpredictability was adored by audiences, but it may feel like trying to regulate a hurricane to a performer who prized control. For a skit that was meant to showcase their disparate skills, the two men ended up sharing the stage. On paper, the plan seemed fantastic. Williams's chaotic spontaneity combined with Martin's meticulous sequencing made for an unmistakable clash in real life. At a pivotal point, Williams, as usual, deviated from the script and launched into a boisterous, unscripted segment that elicited a lot of laughter but totally threw off the pace. For Williams, it was a spontaneous spark of magic. Martin saw it as anarchy. He was left stranded in the center of Williams' hilarious storm as the building he had labored to construct collapsed. Later, in one of his most memorable jokes, Martin talked about the experience of working with his fellow comedian. Reading poetry on a roller coaster is what it's like to perform with Robin. The wonder, the respect, and the sheer confusion of attempting to keep up with a man who never stopped moving were all encapsulated in that statement. Freedom was Williams' roller coaster. It was turmoil for Martin, but there was no resentment in spite of the conflict. Because he saw Robin Williams' unadulterated brilliance and once-in-a-generation talent, Martin held him in the highest regard. Robin's ability to electrify a room and conjure comedy out of thin air, leaving audiences stunned before anyone realized what had happened, was something he admired. Admiration, however, did not equate to compatibility. Following that skit, the two men made the discreet decision to never collaborate again. Cooperation was avoided, but respect was maintained. Their differences revealed more profound realities about comedy in general. Martin stood for order, the sort of comedy that needed time to rehearse, equilibrium, and breathing room. Williams personified chaos and comedy as an unbridled outpouring of creativity, where errors were turned into jokes and no script was ever considered holy. Both strategies were stunning in their own right for viewers. The disparity may be too much for performers attempting to share a stage. Martin, however, never publicly disparaged Williams. His comment about Williams' roller coaster was a poetic recognition of what made him so special, not a barb. Furthermore, Williams never harbored resentment toward Martin. He appreciated Martin's genius from a distance, and he was aware that his manner could overwhelm others. On screen, Goldie Hawn and Steve Martin seemed to be a comic combination made in heaven. Their 1992 movie House Sitter enchanted viewers with its blend of romance, humor, and farce. Their chemistry appeared natural to the audience. Two seasoned actors with impeccable comedic timing bounce off each other. However, the experience wasn't as smooth behind the scenes as it seemed. Although there were no violent altercations or open conflicts, Martin's desire to collaborate with Hawn was subtly damaged by a string of minor annoyances. Steve Martin had always had a methodical approach to humor. He had a performer's appreciation for timing, rehearsal, and preparation thanks to his stand-up experience and years of meticulously perfected routines. He believed that a scene was about rhythm and the unseen structure that allowed comedy to land at the right moment, not just about delivering lines. In contrast, Goldie Hawn thrived on impromptu. Her reputation had been established by her vivacious charm, spontaneous humor, and ability to captivate an audience. She was magnetic because of her looseness, but Martin thought it occasionally came across as irresponsible. It was immediately clear that they had different styles on the House Sitter set. Martin would show up early, prepared, and with the script. Hawn was frequently late. At times, she exuded a casual assurance that only a celebrity of her caliber could possess. She enjoyed improvising, adding gestures or additional lines that weren't part of the script. It kept things interesting and unusual for her. Martin feared it would throw off the meticulous timing he depended on. Although he appreciated her talent, he was plagued by the uncertainty. Off-set, the tension became more subtly intense. Martin pulled out his banjo, an instrument he not only played but also held in high regard, at a celebration held during the film's filming. One of his greatest hobbies was music, especially bluegrass, which he approached with the same seriousness as his comedic style. Goldie, who is always amusing, made a humorous joke about him while he was playing. It was innocuous teasing in a social context for her. It was painful for Martin. In private, his music was hallowed ground, but on stage, he was recognized for his self-deprecating wit. Even though it was a tiny jest, it stuck with him because none of these exchanges ended in disputes. Little slights can mount up, even if Martin stayed kind and professional and Hahn kept shining both on and off screen. Martin had reached a calm conclusion by the time the filming was over. Even though spectators adored their partnership, he didn't want to go through it again. Martin turned down further offers for the two to work together on other projects. Outsiders found it confusing. If a partner had produced box office charm, why wouldn't he want to collaborate with them again? The answer was obvious to those who knew him. With Hahn, Martin had lost harmony, something he treasured. Martin never mentioned Hahn negatively in interviews. He kept his complaints to himself. He didn't lessen her skill either. His actions spoke louder than words, yet his criticisms, if any, were subtle and private. Hollywood loves successful partnerships, and if Martin had agreed, he and Hahn could have worked together more than once. Rather, House Sitter continued to be their only meaningful activity together. Murray-Bill. Rivalries frequently simmer beneath the surface in the comedy industry. On stage or screen, fans see flawless timing, laughing, and companionship. However, relationships and professions can be shaped behind the scenes by egos, tempers, and conflicting personalities. Steve Martin, who is renowned for his methodical approach to comedy and polished professionalism, had one of his most acrimonious arguments with Bill Murray, a man whose humor was as much a part of him as his erratic, rebellious nature. When both guys were at the height of their creative abilities in the late 1970s, the incident that caused the rift occurred during a live sketch performance. Following his hugely popular stand-up tours and Saturday Night Live appearances, Steve Martin had established a reputation for being both brilliantly inventive and incredibly disciplined. He valued preparation, timeliness, and reverence for the trade. In contrast, Bill Murray had a reputation that was nearly the exact opposite. Although renowned for his erratic behavior, tardiness, and propensity to push limits for no other reason, he was also brilliant on stage. Murray arrived at a live sketch show almost an hour late on that fateful night. It was not only unprofessional, but insulting to Martin, who had been practicing, timing the cues, and making sure everything would go as planned. Murray didn't end there either. When he did show up, he publicly made fun of Martin's renownedly clean-cut manner, transforming what ought to have been a mutually humorous victory into a tone war. For Martin, who appeared on stage as the target of Murray's spontaneous jabs rather than as a partner, the audience's laughing just made the situation more painful. There was never overtly explosive tension, but that was a deep cut. Although the performance may have gone unnoticed by the crowd, Martin felt that trust had been betrayed. Reliability is the foundation of rhythm, which is the foundation of comedy. Without it, timing falls apart, and Martin believed Murray had destroyed the link and the moment. There were years of stillness after that. The two comedians didn't talk for more than 10 years after that night. The two men treated each other as strangers, despite the comedy world, which was remarkably small at the top, continuing to place them in the same orbit. They purposefully kept their distance from one another, even at significant business gatherings like the Cannes Film Festival years later, where one might anticipate that former co-workers would at least say hello. There were no recognition nods or backstage chats, just a deliberate and obvious isolation. A portion of the divide resulted from their radically divergent views on labor. Above all, professionalism was important to Steve Martin. For him, it was imperative to be on time, adhere to practice schedules, and regard every performance, whether it be a live sketch, a television tape, or a movie set, as serious labor. In contrast, Bill Murray personified the disorder of improvisation. Sometimes at the expense of others, he thrived on spontaneity. His supporters said that his genius included that disarray. Martin saw it as charm disguised as recklessness. Ironically, both men were titans of their own eras, influencing comedy in ways that are still relevant now. Murray gave American humor an anarchic energy that defied convention and captivated audiences, while Steve Martin added intelligence and a distinct absurdist edge. They may have produced stuff that will be remembered. Rather, what could have been a famous pairing never came to fruition because of the unspoken hatred. Instead of shouting contests or public taunts, the confrontation between Steve Martin and Bill Murray was characterized by a silent rift that speaks more than words ever could. Martin, a perfectionist at heart, could never ignore the fact that the professional relationship had been broken, not by a single joke, but by a breach of trust. He saw Murray's tardiness and derision as more than just inappropriate conduct. They were expressions of disdain for the very profession that characterized their lives. Both humor lovers and historians would reflect on that split years later, feeling a sense of what may have been. Even though both men went on to have remarkable careers, they hardly ever crossed paths again. Maybe that was unavoidable. Two comic poles were represented by Martin and Murray. Structure versus spontaneity, discipline over anarchy. The aftermath was as genuine as the laughing as those poles collided on stage. Jim Carrey Award events are supposed to be celebratory evenings where comedians can pay tribute to one another and share a little of the comedy that made them famous with the public. Sometimes, though, such phases show more than just laughing. They reveal rivalries, annoyances, and divergent comedic ideologies. One of the most notable instances occurred during a comedy awards show in the 1990s, when Steve Martin and Jim Carrey shared a stage, and the outcome was anything but cordial. Jim Carrey was the epitome of manic energy at the time, riding the high of his fame from Ace Ventura, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber. With his crazy voices, rubber-faced attitudes, and seemingly limitless supply of outrageous impressions, he dominated stages. Although audiences enjoyed the mayhem, Carrey's style frequently felt more like a tempest than a craft to an experienced performer like Steve Martin, who appreciated structure, discipline, and the grace of well-timed comedy. During Carrey's acceptance speech, that division reached a breaking point. Carrey jumped right into what was meant to be a quick thank you after being handed the microphone. It turned into a 14-minute free-for-all instead. He flipped between impressions of Elvis Presley, Jimmy Stewart, Clint Eastwood, and even his fellow comedians present. The crowd couldn't decide whether to laugh or cringe because he shouted, he mugged, and he stretched the bit. What began as amusement gradually turned into extravagance, the sort of show that seemed to eat up the space instead of enhancing it. Steve Martin, who was sitting close to the front, became noticeably agitated. Constantly professional, he appreciated conciseness at such occasions, knowing that humor, more than anything else, required rhythm and that award programs had strict timetables. It irritated him to see Carrey take over the scene with unrestrained improvisation. At last, Martin gave a big, exaggerated yawn, a gesture that caught the attention of the audience. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he appeared on stage with a ridiculously large Wrap It Up sign. The audience burst out laughing, certain that it was a bit, two comedy greats planning a light-hearted joke. However, it wasn't. Martin smiled politely, but there was real annoyance behind it. He had simply gone too far with Carrey's disrespect for structure, which is one of his own golden rules of performance. Never show your frustration to the audience. Martin later gave an honest explanation of the incident. Although he appreciated Carrey's skill, he found his manner tiresome. Martin acknowledged that working with Jim was like comedy chaos. Martin believed that comedy was about finding equilibrium, about knowing when to push forward and when to back off. Conversely, Carrey knew only how to push, further, louder, wilder. The altercation continued after the awards ceremony. Later, Hollywood insiders disclosed that Martin had been asked to co-star with Carrey in a possible buddy comedy movie. On paper, it appeared to be a perfect match. Two legendary comedians from disparate eras combined for spectacular effects. Martin, however, refused when he found out that Carrey was attached. He left because he was afraid of having to endure months of the same relentless energy, and because he remembered the awards event. He told buddies it wouldn't work. We are water and oil. In retrospect, their confrontation seemed all but certain. The polished side of comedy, deft wit, absurdist accuracy, and meticulously planned routines have always been embodied by Steve Martin. The contrary was personified by Jim Carrey, who embodied comedy as spectacle, unrestrained improvisation, and raw energy. On their own, both styles were very effective for audiences. However, when combined, they produced conflict rather than unity. Carrey's followers said her performance at the awards presentation was big, bold, unedited, and pure Jim. It served as a reminder to Martin of the importance of discipline in his life. Making people laugh wasn't the only goal of comedy. The goal was to make them laugh in a way that was both lasting and pleasant. For Martin, Carrey's pandemonium ran the risk of destroying everything around it, even though it could have blazed brighter in the moment. There was never any intimacy between the two. They continued to be polite in public, but Martin never insulted him, and Carrie never retaliated. It was obvious how far away. Martin's resistance never changed despite multiple attempts by Hollywood to picture them together. The impact of the awards event was too great. Regarding the 6 co-stars that Steve Martin despises, what are your thoughts? Please share your thoughts in the space provided below. We hope this video has been useful to you. If you enjoy it, remember to subscribe to the channel, share it, and give a like. I appreciate you viewing, and I hope to see you in the upcoming videos. Farewell.